We usually picture the 16th and 17th centuries as the undisputed age of European maritime supremacy. Fleets of galleons were crossing oceans and expanding global empires. Yet, along their own coastlines, those same powerful nations were heavily exposed to an entirely different industry: human harvesting. Looking at this map, you can trace the staggering operating theater of the Barbary corsairs. These state-sponsored raiders preyed on ships and coastal towns across the Mediterranean, but they also sailed far out into the Atlantic Ocean, stretching south to the coast of Brazil and reaching all the way north into the freezing waters of Iceland. While nominally under the protection of the Ottoman Empire, these corsairs operated entirely on their own authority. They launched their fleets out of heavily fortified North African ports, specifically Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, along a stretch of land Europeans called the Barbary coast. The sea during this era served as a lucrative highway for European merchants, but it also functioned as an uncontrollable hunting ground. Millions of Europeans living along the water suddenly found themselves cast as prey. Early on a July morning in 1627, the people of Heimaey, Iceland, woke up to a chilling sight. Out of the dense coastal fog, strange sailing ships silently approached their rocky shores. These ships belonged to the Saleh rovers. Led by Jan Janson, a Dutch privateer who had converted to Islam, this specific corsair fleet successfully bypassed the heavily armed navies of England and Spain to strike an unprotected target in the Arctic. The raiders swarmed the island, capturing over 400 Icelanders in a matter of hours. Among those dragged aboard the ships were Reverend Olafur Egilson, his wife, and his young children. The raid on Heimaey signaled a terrifying expansion of the corsairs' reach. By striking a target so remote, the Saleh rovers demonstrated that distance was no longer a safeguard. Even a village on the edge of the Arctic was now within the theater of the slave trade. After weeks locked below deck, the surviving captives arrived in North Africa and were marched into the Badistan, the local slave market. Many of the newly captured had already succumbed to shock, malnutrition, and disease during the grueling voyage. Free labor was highly prized, but the primary economic engine of these markets was financial extortion. Corsairs targeted wealthy passengers or anyone with family connections, holding them captive in order to demand exorbitant cash ransoms from their home countries. This 1632 petition, written by captured British sailors, reveals the horrific psychological warfare they faced. They beg for ransom, detailing the physical torture and abhorred abuse of their bodies, and the terrifying pressure to convert, facing the bitter perdition of our souls. Barbary captivity terrified the European public because it explicitly aimed to break the mind and the eternal soul. Enslavement was designed to extract total religious conversion, severing a captive from their identity forever. Sultan Moulay Ismail ruled Morocco for decades. He had an insatiable appetite for captives, requiring a constant influx of human labor for his sprawling ambitions. Slaves were confined to fetid, flooded cells infested with vermin, surviving on meager rations. By day, they were worked to the absolute limits of human endurance to build his gargantuan imperial palace complex in Meknes. A Cornish cabin boy named Thomas Pello was captured at age 11 and gifted to the Sultan. Over 23 years, Pello was tortured, forced to convert, and completely assimilated into the Sultan's army. Pello outlived the Sultan, but he never gave up his ambition to escape. On his third attempt, he trekked across treacherous mountains swarming with bandits, miraculously surviving the harsh terrain to reach a British military camp in Gibraltar. Surviving Barbary captivity demanded absolute physical and cultural submission. Yet the psychological drive to return home could endure decades of brutal treatment. Reverend Egilson, the minister taken from Iceland, eventually made it back to Europe to beg for his family's freedom. He spent 10 agonizing years trying to raise ransom funds from a depleted Danish government. His wife was eventually freed, but his children were lost to him forever. State governments were exceptionally slow to act, leaving private church groups to fill the void. Organizations like the Trinitarian Order specialized in raising charitable funds to liberate captives, famously paying the ransom for a Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes after 5 agonizing years of enslavement. Even with these charitable efforts, the vast majority of victims were left behind. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans languished in North Africa, unable to buy their freedom, and ultimately died in captivity. The European state response proved remarkably impotent. Coastal citizens were left completely vulnerable to raids, and once captured, their survival depended almost entirely on private charity rather than government intervention. Looking at this academic paper title, we see the term captivity anxiety. The relentless, unpredictable threat of corsair raids generated a pervasive terror that seeped into all levels of British and European society. This collective trauma resulted in a massive outpouring of literature. Petitions, dramatic plays, and Sunday sermons fixated on the horrors of forced conversion, firmly establishing the Islamic world as a dangerous, alien adversary in the European imagination. The legacy of these raids went beyond the families destroyed or the ransoms paid. For generations of Europeans, the sea was no longer just a source of wealth. It was a source of persistent existential anxiety. This collective trauma helped cement a view of the Islamic world as a perpetual adversary, a perception that would influence European rhetoric and policy for years to come.